The challenge that I would throw back at Dimi is that, okay, maybe the two-state debate is dead. What else is there? I mean, I have yet to have anybody in the region, and I spend a lot of time there, tell me what a viable one-state solution looks like. And and we can talk about the years of bloodshed, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. We want 100 years of bloodshed, 200 years of bloodshed. The two-state solution might nearly be dead, but we might just have to keep on breathing a little bit of life into it, and we might have to keep on pushing open the door. So I'm not sure that people are really honest about what the alternative looks like.
Right, yeah, thanks. Okay, so some really big questions that I think that need to be addressed. I mean, the question of this, does Israel, and in my case, Israeli academic institutions, do they have a siege mentality such that anyone who raises criticisms of their policy or their occupation or their lack of responsibility, taking responsibility for the Nakba, or their discrimination against Palestinian Israeli citizens, is their mentality such that all those people will be dismissed as anti-Semites, they'll draw up the bridges and they won't listen, and you can have no effect on them? Is that the case? And is that the situation on Israeli campuses? Because you sometimes hear that from opponents of BDS. Or is it the case that actually those campuses are the most liberal places on earth, and if you target them, you're targeting the only part of Israeli society that is critical, and so you're doing the wrong thing? Because it has to be one or the other for the argument to make sense. So the thing is that I take a middle position, actually, and there are interesting rifts in both Israeli society and Israeli academia that are opening up right now that BDS can exploit. Because if you have a non-violent strategy of resistance, then you do have to divide in this case, Zionism. Else it won't work, because they will use maximal repression. So, and this is an element of political strategy. It's not the case that everybody in the BDS movement is some kind of child who flannels along and doesn't know anything about political strategy and how you make things work on the ground, and is in hoc to sort of emotional reasoning where we can't think about strategies. I mean, the doctor over here, you focused on the least significant aspect of the BDS movement, which is sanctions. 10% of Israeli academics are anti-Zionist, which means they're beyond the pale. That's what the campus watchdogs are saying. So they're ultra-Zionist organizations, they don't say they are, but they are saying about Israeli academics. And, you know, so, if we're going to talk about McCarthyism, the new McCarthyism is happening, sure, in a connection between right-wing Republican politics in the United States and Likudnik moves to the right that have constantly been happening in Israel right now. But that opens up fissures in Israeli society that precisely these Israeli academics who've been called anti-Zionist in these new watchdogs are horrified that they've been called such, and they don't recognize that. But they realize that they're coming under threat because they don't simply salute the flag. And the conflicts that are arising in Israeli society between the settlers and the IDF, between the segregationist movements on the buses and a more left or liberal Zionism, between liberal Zionism in the United States, between Thomas Friedman and other more, Newt Gingrich-style, Adelson, casino-owning, funded movements in the United States. These are movements that are happening right now and that are dividing Israelis. And don't tell me that it's not a strategic move to think that if you have a critical space on campus in Israeli universities, which there is a small critical space on campus, it's quite well illustrated by the Judith Butler example, who wasn't on an official visit that was sponsored by the Israeli university as part of normal routine academia. She didn't go to discuss her book on gender trouble, just like I don't want to go to discuss obscure theses about the Egyptian guilds from 19th century Egypt in Tel Aviv University, because it feels complicit if Palestinian colleagues can't even come to speak at my panel because they're behind a wall. So the thing is, the Judith Butler is a good example. Why this idea that the boycott leads to a silencing effect? How is that evidenced by this room tonight? We're having a dialogue because the boycott actually stimulates conversations, and anybody who's been involved in it knows that. From the first moment that you start militating on the boycott, you're deluged with conversation. And so it's a very good way to address those kinds of issues. So, and I think the Judith Butler example, it illustrates as, first of all, a critical space in Tel Aviv University. Second of all, a rector who, you know, is deep in Israel's military-industrial complex, as we know from all sorts of evidence that I can send you, who was disgusted and didn't even know that Judith Butler was. I mean, it's a very good example of the target, which is very strategic of the academic boycott, is of Israeli academic institutions, and it doesn't do political tests of individual academics. It has nothing to do with that, and that's been, you know, it's extraordinary. I mean, we have to get that bit straight. You cannot argue that the BDS movement targets individuals, academics, for their political or ideological affiliations, because that's not what happens. That's not been part of the movement for the last 5 or 10 years. So since the last 5.5 years, let's say. So you know, but those big questions: are Israelis so paranoid about anti-Semitism that they will never listen, and so it's not worth bringing a boycott campaign to their doorstep to create a critical space? When I was at Edinburgh University, there was a war game program in the informatics department, and I found it very difficult to complain about that. But had there been an outside campaign that said, actually, we're not going to come and lecture at your university because we don't think what you're doing in the informatics department is acceptable, it would have given me, a critical academic on the inside, some space to write a letter to the administration and say, I don't think this is the role of the university. And that's precisely the strategy at the university's important site of struggle in a modern, you know, biopolitical regime. And so if you can move opinion in a university about what is the role of a university, it's significant. And that tactic can propagate, because you could do it as an academic, you can do it as a lawyer, you can do it as an architect. And so it is a meaningful strategy, and it's not the case that boycotters are all woolly-headed, you know, moralizing, incapable sort of children when it comes to that question.
Yeah, first of all, Shari, your question. You invited me, so I can't ignore you. I think that the whole BDS conversation in America, if you follow it, you will see how relevant it is to American policy. It's about double standard. The whole BDS campaign has opened in America academia and in the alternative press, and now in other part of the public scene in America, the question of the preferred status that Israel has, now that there are so many recent examples, although there are also past examples, the many recent examples, what happens when America decided someone is worthy of a policy of sanction, bombing, and occupation. And then the whole question is, why was Israel exempted ever for even such a discussion? So I think it is about America policy as a whole. Israel is such an important, crucial part of the American double standard, immorality, and imperialism that I don't think that this conversation in any way bypasses questions of America's role in the 21st century. So I think we are dealing with it. About strategizing, I think there are 3 campaigns. We have to understand there are 3 campaigns that are now simultaneously taking place for the liberation of the Palestinians from oppression. One is the popular resistance, which is part of the kind of revolution we see in the Arab world altogether. It is not still there. It hasn't matured yet. We are in the middle of the process. Maybe we are in the beginning of the process. I don't know. There are even internal Palestinian elements that block the popular resistance from bursting out and so on. But this is the zeitgeist in the Arab world and in this place, that all these previous academic and political discourses of political elites that would bring peace and solution are collapsing. You can see it in your own country when it comes to financial matters. Don't just think about Palestine in this respect. So I think there is the beginning, also inside Israel, among the Palestinians and among the Palestinian refugees. So that's one campaign. The second campaign is the campaign that has to be happening in it, that has to happen in Israel itself, which is an educational campaign, transforming people's frame of mind and mindset, deprogramming them, which is a very long-term campaign. It's a very difficult campaign to succeed in. It has to succeed. It has to be pursued, but it cannot be the one element that is highest on our priority because of its longevity. You cannot sort of rely on it while the oppression goes on. And there is the campaign from the outside, the BDS campaign, which actually is not about bringing a solution and is not about changing the whole reality on the ground, because for this you need the whole three campaigns together to succeed, but it wants to change the conversation. And we are changing the conversation. We have a different conversation. The conversation used to be, what do you do with the people, as Abba Ibn used to put it, who never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity? What do you do with people like Arafat and Abu Mazen, and before that other Palestinian leaders? Now what do you do with Islam? What do you do with Muslims? We changed the conversation. The conversation is, what do you do about a rogue state like Israel? How do you treat it? What is the right policy towards a country, a state, that violates systematically all the United Nations resolution, that violates systematically and abuses civil and human rights? This is now the conversation. This is why all these pro-Zionist Jewish communities are so fidgety. This is why all the Israeli embassies have nightly meetings. What do we do? Not in changing Israel immoral behavior. How do we now justify Israel immoral behavior when the conversation is about our immorality? So I don't think it's just about strategy. Strategy is working very well because the conversation is where the Israelis have now to face it. Second point, and I have three very short points, I promise. The second point is, we were told that the situation on the ground is getting worse. I agree. It's not because of the BDS. Come on. You think BDS elected Netanyahu? Netanyahu is the inevitable result of Zionism. What do you think you will get? You colonize someone else's place. You expel almost half of them in 1948. You occupy the whole of Palestine. And you're surprised that you have someone like Netanyahu as the Prime Minister of Israel? What do you expect, Mother Teresa to head Israel? What it has to do with the BDS? On the contrary, because you have now Netanyahu, you have more supporters of the BDS. It's the other way around. The BDS is a much better chance, one has to admit, when you have a rogue government running a rogue state. You used to have a rogue state run by liberal Zionists, and that was more difficult to expose. Now it's easier. But it's not because of the BDS that there are more settlers. This was the Zionist plan from 1967 to have more settlers. The last point. We are entrenching, last and a half. We are entrenching the Israeli public, academia. The Israelis are so entrenched they can tell you what lies at the heart of the globe. Believe me. If you don't know what lies at the heart of this planet, ask the Israelis. They are so entrenched in their position. Nothing will entrench them further. In fact, the only thing that would help them to get out, as I agree, the Butler, I'm very glad you brought the Butler example. This was the first time that this little rector was raised above the entrenchment. Thank God. He will think about what he has seen. He will think about what he heard. And I think that's what we are doing. We are forcing them to get out of the trenches rather than being in trenches.